Naturally, my time in that field has covered a lot of unusual inventions, discoveries, and ideas. What I'm going to present to you this evening is not just one technology, but actually a detective story which starts with the life of Nikola Tesla and culminates in some present activities that Stephen has previously mentioned. And it's going to cover a variety of interesting concepts and ideas which gives direction to the pursuits that I have personally had, and hopefully shed some light on a broader understanding of all this stuff for you folks. This gentleman, of course, is Nikola Tesla, and when I was a college student, I was completely enamored by the man and the things that he was able to accomplish in his lifetime. And the thing that really captivated my attention was the work that he did in Colorado Springs in his laboratory there, in which he actually did a great deal of experimental and pre-practical work on the transmission of electrical power without wires. And I'm going to start the presentation with that direction simply because of the fact that it gives impetus to the entire thing. Two things that are very interesting to note about this facility, which was in Colorado Springs. First of all, the wireless transmission of power does not mean by means of radio. You know, our training in the modern world is such that people are more or less programmed to believe that the term wireless pertains to like a remote control, wireless internet connections and that type of thing. But in Tesla's vernacular, the word wireless meant electrical current distribution on a global scale without transmission facilities, which is really a very different idea. And it was accomplished by a very different means than what we attempt to do today. The preliminary work that was done in order to achieve that end was done with a device called a magnifying transmitter, which Tesla engineered. And this is, incidentally, I apologize for the poor quality of some of these pictures, but they're very old. And some of them are actually original, so they're a little grainy. But this is the secondary coil of his transmitter, which you can see is throwing off huge amounts of electrical discharge. And the thing that's interesting about that is, you know, Tesla was quite a showman. And a lot of the things that he did, which got recorded for posterity, were done strictly to make an impression. In the properly tuned magnifying transmitter, there is no electrical discharge. And this is something that I learned as a pretty young student in physics, because I was really annoyed with kids in science fair projects making Tesla coils that did nothing but shoot out, you know, 3 and 4 foot sparks. And I said, well, that's great. What does it do? Well, that's what it does. It makes sparks. Well, that is not what Tesla's intention was. And the thing that's interesting about the magnifying transmitter and its direct association with wireless transmission of power actually lies in the fact that there is a very special winding involved in this structure, which makes use of a Tesla wave, which is not a sinusoidal wave, a very special wave function, which when properly implemented causes some very unusual things to happen in RLC circuits. And the work that was done in Colorado Springs was a pioneering effort to demonstrate to him successfully that this idea could be implemented on a global scale. What he was actually intending to do was to tap the energy in the ionosphere, which is delivered by the sun directly, and thereby use the entire planet as a solar receiver, and then distribute that energy globally without the use of wires. And this is one of the reasons why J.P. Morgan went a little bit ballistic and decided to pull the plug on the funding. This picture depicts the same facility with various tuned coils that are receiving discharges from the main oscillator circuit, and again demonstrates Tesla's interest in being a showman. He has a picture of himself sitting there, which he would never be crazy enough to do, because this is actually a double exposure.
That's right.
Now the story gets a little bit more interesting when we start to examine the fact that Tesla was really the true author of radio, not Marconi. And this has been proven and even You know, it's even been demonstrated in court that this is an actual fact. Of course, they waited till after he was dead to give him the credit, which is always nice. But that's the way our society operates. J.P. Morgan actually encouraged Marconi, who was unceremoniously rejected from his patents applications in radio, to reapply long after the fact that he was rejected by the patent office. And miraculously, he was given a primary patent on radio technology. And immediately that patent was used as the basis for the formation of the RCA Corporation, in which GE slash, what's his name, Morgan had controlling interests. And this is the first facility where they built a transatlantic transmitting station in New Brunswick, New Jersey, that was used to commercialize radio on a grand scale. It was actually put into service before World War I on a preliminary basis, and then again after World War II, it was, after World War I, it was reinstated for public use, and some very interesting things went on there. The guy in the middle of this picture, the little dwarf there, is Steinmetz. Steinmetz was actually hired by General Electric Corporation to debunk Tesla's work because of the so-called free energy aspects associated with it. The gentleman standing next to him on his right-hand side is Albert Einstein, and the gentleman leaning over, two guys down from him, is David Sarnoff, who is the acting vice president of RCA Corporation. Tesla was actually invited to this proceeding, but he declined.
What year is it?
It's actually written there. I think it's 1901 that this occurred. And Tesla actually declined this invitation because he realized that what they were trying to do was to get him into an argumentative discourse with Einstein. That whole thing would have reacted into a debate concerning the theory of relativity. The reason for this, of course, is the fact that Einsteinian relativity is actually a perversion of the work of Boskovic, who was an alchemist who lived 100 years before Tesla in Serbia. And Tesla was a guy who gave great reverence to the work of Boskovic, and Tesla, unbeknownst to the general public, had his own theory of relativity, which was extracted directly from Boskovic's work and had to do with the rotation of non-Newtonian reference frames. So the two theories were directly at odds with one another, and the powers to be wanted to put an end to it one way or another and marry all of the emerging technologies into one massive theory which they would have control over and give the appearance of a uniform science that was unfolding in that time period. And that was really what was intended, but Tesla didn't fall into the trap. The next few slides are just pictures of the interior of the transmitting station, and the reason why they're interesting is primarily because of this generator. This was a 200,000 watt generator which supplied the power for the entire station. I think it was at a frequency of 200,000 cycles or something of that nature. And at the time it was the most powerful generating facility available for the use in radio. And it was actually engineered by this guy Ernst Alexanderson. And Ernst openly admitted that the design was based on Tesla's work with high-frequency rotational components, but having been denied outside funding when he was doing it, miraculously it was scaled up to this size with the help of J.P. Morgan. So that makes it even more obvious that Tesla was definitely out of sync with the powers that be. And down the story moves to Wardenclyffe, Long Island, where Tesla was actually building this facility, which was funded by J.P. Morgan to the tune of probably $500,000 or so. And simultaneously, while Tesla was endeavoring to finish this facility, behind the scenes, J.P. Morgan was actually manipulating things so that he would wind up with control of the radio aspect through Marconi if Tesla failed. Now, Tesla had very ambitious ideas concerning this facility. What he really wanted to do was have a world communications center in one plant in which he used wireless power technology to send signals globally all over the world that covered not only radio as we know it today, but telegraphy, telephone, telegraph, probably television eventually, and millions and millions of available channels, which is amazing considering the fact that it wasn't done with cable multiplexing like we do stuff today. It was done with his own system, which he called individualization. But what we all know happened was that Marconi beat him to the punch by sending a signal across the English Channel, and Marconi said, good, I got the winner. He pulled the plug on Tesla's funding, and the tower was never finished. But here is an architectural rendering of how it would have looked with the electrode in place, and eventually the bottom beamwork would have been covered by an external wall, and so the whole thing would have taken on a very bizarre and interesting sort of sci-fi appearance. Now, here's Tesla making some entries into a notebook, and I'm mentioning this ahead of time because this notebook turns out to be a very, very intriguing aspect of this entire presentation. I call it, for lack of a better word, the blue notebook. Now, I'll get back to what that means in a moment. In I think it was 1932, Tesla was residing at the Pennsylvania Hotel in New York City, and there was a young guy who was studying commercial art in one of the universities in Brooklyn by the name of Otis T. Carr. And Otis T. Carr was working at the Pennsylvania Hotel as a package clerk, night shift. And he found himself delivering birdseed to this guy's suite constantly in 5- and 10-pound bags, and he said, where the hell is all this birdseed going? And he made it his own objective to find out who the guy behind the door was. Well, it turned out it was Tesla, because Tesla had a mania for feeding the pigeons population of New York, which he used to do in Bryant Park in the wee hours of the morning. And the rumor goes, and I say it's a rumor because I don't think it's ever been proven unequivocally, but nonetheless, the rumor goes that, that Carr, as a young man, was befriended by Tesla, and some kind of information exchanged hands. Now, the reason why this is pertinent is because of the fact that the previous facts that I disclosed demonstrate very strongly that he had already fallen out of good graces not only with the financial institutions of the world, but also with the scientific community, and he knew that. He knew he was going to be blackballed. And the thing that makes the whole story really interesting is that it appears, and I mean I haven't been able to prove this, but all the indications definitely indicate that Tesla decided to embark upon a really interesting experiment and launch a certain amount of his unpublished information into the future by entrusting a notebook to this fellow Otis T. Carr. In 1953, I think it was, Carr formed a corporation in Baltimore, Maryland called OTC Enterprises. And one of the first things that he came out with as the company's objective was the construction and utilization of a paragravitic craft which essentially produced its own gravitational field. And he wanted to mass produce these and use them to enter the space race and win the entire contest against the rocket, which of course was a point of interest for scientists at that time. I'd like to read, just for the moment, an interesting excerpt from Tesla's own biography, his autobiography, which relates to this very subject. He says here, what I was working on 20 years ago was a wireless transmission of electrical power. My original idea for a flying machine was a device propelled by electric motors which would receive power by wireless means from stations located on the Earth. However, eventually, I began to consider the problem from a different point of view, and I realized that it was a mechanical rather than an electrical problem. The flying machines of the future, my flying machines, will be heavier than air, but it will not be an airplane. It will have neither wings nor propellers. You might see it on the ground and you would never guess it was a flying machine at all. Yet it will be able to move at will through the air in any direction with perfect safety and at higher speeds than have yet been achieved by any craft. It will be able to remain absolutely stationary in the air, even in a wind, for great lengths of time. Its lifting power will not be dependent upon any delicate devices such as the wings of a bird, but upon positive mechanical action. It is the child of my dreams, the product of years of intense and painful toil and research. I am not going to talk about it any further, but whatever my airship may be, here at least is an engine that will do things that no other engine has ever done before. Now that's a very interesting statement, and considering the fact that Carr's first project was a flying machine that fits those criteria, I just find it a really interesting coincidence. This is Carr holding one of the first mock-up models of his OTC X-1 spacecraft. Later, when this thing was more refined and he had the corporation well underway and he had a considerable amount of funding, by the way, he actually went on TV with Long John Neville and debated this entire issue on the national TV circuit. And that's him demonstrating the 18-inch machined model of this craft to Mr. Neville. This is a close-up of the interior of the craft as it looks in the model. And you can see that it has rotational capacitors and also a series of interesting geometric objects which Carr referred to as Utrons. And those turn out to be a very significant piece of work which I believe is traceable back to Tesla. That's another view of the craft from above. Now this is Major Wayne Aho, who was at the time supposedly associated with the United States Army, I believe it was, or the Air Force, and he's holding the finished mock-up, and one of his jobs in the OTC Enterprise system was as public liaison and in support of the concept of so-called flying saucers. This picture here is a very interesting one. It shows in partial view the 6-foot preliminary craft, which was supposedly actually energized and later took part in some public demonstrations. This is the skeletal structure of the OTC X-1, and this is an interesting picture here, which was snapped of one of Otis Carr's advertisements, where he actually intended to put up a complete manufacturing facility to make these spacecraft, and you'll notice that there's one hanging on the edge of the sign. This is the 45-foot model, which was actually constructed and demonstrated in Oklahoma City back in the 50s. I don't remember the exact date. But the reason why this is interesting is because of the fact that the ship had some real interesting and devastating electromechanical problems, and there was an onboard accident. I later learned that it was a mercury leak in the so-called Utron accumulators, and there was an explosion, and Carr wound up in the hospital. There he is there with mercury poisoning. Now, after this event happened, he moved his entire facility out to the West Coast, and shortly after that he was jailed for stock fraud, which is one way of getting rid of pioneers. This character right here is myself back in 1962, and my passion at the time was particle accelerators. This was my first or second entry in the National Science Talent Search with a small Cockcroft-Walton voltage multiplier powered proton accelerator, and I was doing experiments with the disintegration of boron at the time. My honest interest back then was to pursue nuclear physics as a career, concentrating primarily on high-energy particle physics, which of course would have probably landed me at MIT or someplace like that. But that's not the way things worked out. This is a larger accelerator, which had a capacity of about 500,000 electron volts, which I built in my basement. When most kids were out haunting the bars and chasing skirts, I was building these things. And that's me at the controls to this contraption. And what happened that changed all of this was that my dad died of a heart attack in my senior year, and I was forced to go to work in a local shipyard to put myself through college. And what happened after that is really kind of interesting. I was given a very interesting book as a present by a young lady I was dating at the time. The name of the book was They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers. It was written by a guy named Gray Barker. And the way that fits into the equation is that somewhere in the midst of this book there was a name mentioned of a guy by the name of Dominic Lucchesi. And Lucchesi was a very outspoken individual who openly remarked that he knew a great deal about the UFO field and what was really going on, and that in fact he lived in Jersey City and gave his address. Well, I was floored by that because I lived in Jersey City. Now, I didn't know this guy existed, but after I heard that, I became good friends with him, and we exchanged a lot of information, and he was one of the first people to tell me about the OTC Enterprise. And he also told me that there was a man in Connecticut by the name of Gene Carini, who was in fact the original technician of Otis Carr, and who was looking for financial and technical help in the development of a practical electric car. So I promptly got into my Mustang, blasted up to Connecticut, met this guy, and before I knew it, he made me Director of Research and Development for his company, which at the age of 19 was a pretty amazing undertaking. This little car right here, which didn't come out too well, is a King Midget Racer, which was one of the first cars that we converted to this system. Now I have to tell you that it wasn't very long, despite my innocence and youth, before I realized that something wasn't right with this arrangement. This is the power pack of the car, which is very interesting because even though you can't see it too well, it consists of several motors affixed to the circumference of a large flywheel, and the motors and flywheel rotate in unison and develop ungodly amounts of torque. And this was the concept that he was using to propel these vehicles. Now theoretically, this was supposed to have an advantage, actually a work advantage, in that the power that was delivered to the wheels was greater than the power that was consumed from the batteries. And of course, even though I didn't know anything about so-called free energy in those days, it seemed to me that if that was happening, there ought to be a reason for it. And when I started questioning Carini about this, I backed him into a corner, and eventually he admitted to me that he had learned the concept from a blue notebook in the possession of Otis Carr. And that really turned me on, because I was now more determined than ever to get to the bottom of the Blue Notebook mystery. But anyway, in the meantime, since I was hired to develop these things, my job as a machinist and a young engineer was to figure out how the devil it worked and what we could do to optimize it. Well, we had a very backwards thinking board of directors in this company, which by then was called Energy Systems Incorporated, I believe. And their idea was, let's just make money. You don't need prototypes or instruments, and we're not going to spend the money for it. So what I wound up doing was building a lot of stuff from scratch. Building a lot of stuff from scratch on my own to try and prove or disprove the theory. And this is one of the devices that we concocted, which is a torque transducer, a torque and velocity transducer that's mounted in such a way to look at the torque speed characteristics of a motor that's free to rotate in two directions simultaneously. The theory being that Newton's third law suggests that if you can harness the active power as well as the reaction to the power, that you'll wind up with twice the amount for the same cost. Well, as it turns out, that particular avenue of approach did not bear fruit. This is another view of the device that we built. And then this is the back side of it. But this one here was a miniature version of the propulsion system that was placed in the car. And this did have very striking and unusual characteristics, even though it was not over unity. And the test that I did with this lingered in the back of my mind for the next 20 years and only came into use recently. But anyway, we wound up building some pretty sizable units based on this concept. This is a 4-foot model of the energized flywheel. And unfortunately, that was a straw that broke the camel's back. It only was something like 27% efficient, which is a long way from over unity. But despite all of that, the stockholder said, well, let's put one of these units in a larger car, and let's take it out of the back of the car and put it on the wheels directly so that we don't have a transmission to worry about, and I'm sure we'll get astounding results. And so we built this thing out of a Corvair that had 4-foot wheels on the back of it, taken from a cotton harvester that we purchased secondhand in Louisiana. And it was a monstrosity. I used to joke about the fact that all you have to do is take off the emergency brake and it would take off, considering it was always going downhill. But it didn't really function very well. And so the company fell apart. I then returned to New Jersey and went to work in the shipyard again and started going to school nights. That's me in the engine room of one of the tugboats out there. And that's me at the propeller of one of the tugboats. And during that time period, I was privileged to follow up on a contact that I had made through Carini about a guy in northern Michigan who had supposedly been building, in secret, a 32-foot spacecraft in an isolated hangar on the shores of Lake Huron. And I finally got the guy's phone number, and I traveled up there with a colleague of mine and met this very curious individual by the name of Gratz. And this isn't too clear, but this is a picture of a 30-foot pyramid that he's built in this so-called City of Light of his. And his cover story for all this activity was the fact that as a boy he had been contacted by aliens, and they had entrusted him with all this secretive information which he was eventually supposed to introduce to the human race to better the world, providing that they were kind enough to embrace universal law. Universal law was supposedly the religion of the universe, which all of the civilized planets practiced, and the barbaric planet of Earth had yet to embrace. So anyway, he was teaching this and selling real estate at the same time so that you could become a member of the City of Light. And I moved up there to work on this. That's a better picture of the pyramid. I moved up there to work on this project. And the interesting thing about it was true. They had this huge hangar. There's a picture of it there. It was on a little cove off Lake Huron. And the ASDP stands for Advanced Saucer Development Project. And inside this hangar, which really floored me when I saw it, this is a picture of the top of the craft. This was a 15-foot in diameter central passenger compartment and a 32-foot flange. And this thing was built in a very, very painstaking manner, which gave the impression that it was definitely based on something serious.
Where is the inside?
No, this is the outside of the ship. This is the inside. This was the little control panel and one of the portholes. And this is underneath the ship showing the transmission, which was designed in such a way that the flange rotated in one direction, the counter flange in the other, while the cab remained stationary. All the gearing in this transmission was custom made with phenolic and aluminum. There was no ferromagnetic material in it at all, and that's because of the huge magnetic field supported by the ship, which they claimed would burn up if they, due to inductive heating, if they had used steel. This is a picture of the underflange of the ship and the huge magnetic field that was positioned there. And after having worked on this ship for several months, I was in an interesting position. Winter came in northern Michigan, and if you've ever lived there, especially having come from Jersey City, you find out that you're subjected to some really vicious natural phenomenon with 60 below zero winters and things of that sort. And I was lucky to make it alive through the first winter in a cabin of my own building. So having learned that lesson the hard way, I applied for a job in a local facility, which was across the Sound in a place called Drummond Island. And this was a dolomite facility run by Bethlehem Steel Corporation, and they were looking for an electrical superintendent. And since I was the only idiot available at the time, they figured, well, this country boy might be okay. So they hired me, and that's a picture of me with my little pickup truck there. But the thing that makes this part of the story interesting is the fact that they were having some severe problems with the local utility companies because they were gouging them something ferocious on their demand. Because every time this mill started up, or any time that they had a boat loading conveyor loaded to the gunnels with rock, whenever they started it, they just pegged the meters. And so they were getting crucified with their electric bills. And they came to me one day and they said, is there anything you can do about this for us? And I said, yeah, if you've got the necessary equipment or if you're willing to foot the bill, I'll be happy to lend assistance. So in my spare time, which is kind of copious in those days, I built a 800,000 VAR synchronous capacitor for these guys, which you can see the housing for and the transformer yard for. And this was mostly built from scraps of things that they intended to get rid of. That's me standing next to a Ward Leonard MG set, which was propelled by a 1932 vintage General Electric synchronous motor, 4,160 volts, and I think it was 1,800 RPM. And anyway, with this facility, not only was I able to cut 20% off of their electric bill, but I was also able to actually rock the government generating station at Sault Ste. Marie 60 miles away every time that I decided to trim the lines. So it didn't take long before the power company decided to investigate and see if we had bypassed their meters, because the demand went down so low they couldn't believe that we hadn't done something illegal. This is the main control panel for that facility, and this is a view of the exciter and the biasing controls for the magnetic field. And this is a very interesting picture, although it really came out terribly. This is a Fairbanks Morse OP engine that was across the river in Detour, Michigan, and was used as a peaking station or a holding station whenever the links with the government generating facility were down. And it takes a very interesting part in this story, because I developed a theory at this point in time that I wanted to test, and I befriended the guy who ran this generating station, and I said, listen, the next time that you're isolated from Sault Ste. Marie, let me know, and we'll run an interesting little experiment. I want to try to oscillate power, as Tesla suggested, and see what the outcome would be. So as it turns out, this is the control panel for that facility. As it turned out, there was a very vicious ice storm sometime in November. I don't remember what the year was, but it was in the 70s, probably 75. And naturally, they isolated from the generating station at Sault Ste. Marie, and I took the ferry boat over to Drummond Island, set my machine on the line, and deliberately reversed the polarity of the regulator and encouraged oscillations. Now, I'm not talking about oscillations of current or voltage, but oscillations of power, which are entirely different. The net result was that we destroyed a lot of Christmas decorations that night, and a lot of other interesting things occurred in the village, but the net result was staggering. The engines reached a point where they saw no load, and they just went absolutely quiet and remained that way until I took my equipment offline. And then I started thinking about this, and I said, this is the kind of stuff that Tesla was talking about, and this is the kind of stuff I want to pursue. So I began meditating on this whole subject and spent a lot of time in this little shop building that belonged to a friend of mine, dreaming up ways to try to miniaturize what I had done on a larger scale. And one morning I had an epiphany in which I got the design for a small generator that worked on an entirely different principle, and this thing we called the Dynaflux alternator. Now the thing that's interesting about this, considering this was the very first prototype, when we put a load on it, there was absolutely no torque reflected to the prime mover. The current didn't change one iota. And so I thought, wow, this is really pretty amazing. Here we have a pretty good demonstration of over-unity, considering that a segregated load analysis showed that when you accounted for all the losses, you definitely had a conversion efficiency that was not one-to-one. Anyway, I built several versions of this prototype. There's a larger one that was actually powered with a magnet from a Klystron oscillator, permanent magnet. And then ultimately, when I came back to the New York area to raise some money, I built this presentation model, which produced about 400 watts, and compared it to the functioning of a standard off-the-shelf generator, and got the same result. This was the little control panel that we had. And interestingly enough, during this time period, I had been pretty detached from the gang in Michigan, and Mr. Carini had retired and gone to Florida, and all of a sudden I got a mysterious phone call from him that he wanted me to come to Florida right away. He wouldn't tell me why, but he sent me a plane ticket, so I went. And here's me and Carini down in his little getaway in Florida. And what it turned out to be was that he had located Otis Carr, who apparently had been in jail, and was now released, and they wanted to resurrect one of Carr's last projects, and they wanted to know if I wanted to be involved. And the thing they were talking about was a device called the Hummingbird Home Power Unit. Now, I'd heard a lot about this in the earlier days, but never seen any evidence that it existed, and I never had the slightest suspicion of how it was supposed to operate. But the thing that turned out to be interesting, they had a model of it, which they apparently had built in the 50s. It was stashed away in a van, shoved back in the Everglades where nobody would find it, rotten, full of mold and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, I took one look at this, and I realized that I had seen it before. And where I saw it was on the Blue Notebook in the possession of Mr. Gratz in Michigan. And I didn't realize it was the same Blue Notebook until I met Mr. Carr. And when I finally located Carr, he was in an old age home in Pittsburgh, or a suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I proceeded to tell him about all the things that I had done with Carini and on my own. And when I mentioned the Gratz situation, he told me a fascinating story. He said, I know that bastard. He said, Gratz is the guy that I tried to hire to replace Carini. And he said what happened was that he had been released from the Army on a Section 8. And when I checked with the Army and they verified that he was a cuckoo bird, he said I had to let him go. And he said what happened, the very next night my lab was broken into, my models were stolen, and a very precious Blue Notebook of mine was stolen. So I said, well, I have seen this notebook. So he employed me to please try and get it back, which I never succeeded in doing. But the thing that was interesting was, he then started to touch on the theory of this so-called hummingbird power supply. And he insisted on the fact that you can't see it in this picture, but there are two outspread arms with very large weights on it, which are made to synchronously rotate, supposedly interacting with the Earth's gravitational field and producing a torque, which the average value of which supersedes the motors that are driving it, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, we never got to see this thing work, and unfortunately Carr died shortly after that. But it becomes a very pivotal part of the story. This is the finished version of the OTC-X1 demonstration craft, which was in Carini's possession in Florida. And a few years after Carr died, and I had my own company going, I kept being haunted by these ideas of the energized flywheel, the various devices of Carr, and I decided to investigate them on my own very seriously because I now have the wherewithal to do so. So I started with a very simple arrangement, which was in fact an embodiment that was suggested in a Tesla article called The Rotation of the Moon. And this was the only article Tesla ever published that was given enormous fanfare. And not only that, but it was in 3 consecutive monthly publications. I forget what magazine it was in. Century magazine, I think it was. In which he describes and supports mathematically his contentions that the moon does in fact rotate. But it does so in a very peculiar manner in which one revolution of the moon coincides with one rotation around the Earth. And that's the reason why we only see one side of it. If it wasn't rotating and it went around the Earth, you'd see all sides of the moon. And I kept racking my brain saying, oh, what the heck does it matter? What is this guy so preoccupied with this moon thing for when his deal was electromagnetics? So I started looking for an anomaly because I figured if Tesla's supporting it with all that vigor, there must be something there. And this picture here shows the first model of that was actually energized with a motor, but not allowed to turn. And what I did was I did static torque measurements on the facility, and I found out something very, very interesting. What I discovered was that if you make your measurements relative to the bench, you get one set of figures. If you make your measurements relative to the model, you get another set of figures. And that blew my mind, but it was certainly anomalous. So I started to figure out what the heck can that possibly mean. And suddenly it dawned on me that there were several things happening which were not obvious. I went back to Carini, who had some shyster lawyer friend that has down in Florida, who had lots of money that he used to blow on baccarat. And I said to him, look, instead of throwing your money away on that nonsense, why don't you give me $5,000? I want to build a model. So he actually did. He gave me the money. I built this model, which is very curious, because it's set up the same way as a Carini device, except it only has one motor. And instead of having both the stator and the armature of the motor involved in rotation, what happens is the stator is actually free to turn, but it's secured to an outer track by a ball bearing follower system. And what I found out that was interesting, even though the motor is DC, if I change the setting of that ball bearing and change its length, which changes the torque to the stator torque to armature torque ratio, it actually reverses its direction without you reversing the direction of the current. Ah, says I, there are two torques involved, and there always have been, but nobody has bothered to isolate them or understand their results. And so with that in mind, I suddenly realized that what Tesla was trying to tell people was the secret of the magnifying transmitter and a lot of the other stuff that he was doing with real power amplification resided in the fact that power is apparently relativistic. And so then I realized, since he was so hung up on Boscovich's work, that we're talking about relative motion of angular reference frames. So I started to design experiments in which I studied the effects of supplying power to unusual arrangements in which there was an orbital motion involved. And this little guy here brings to light some very interesting results. There's a tag mark on this shaft on both ends, and yet if you turn this motor at a very low speed, this entire assembly will rotate. The interesting thing about it is this side of the shaft makes 2 turns. The other side of the shaft makes 1 turn. It's a physical impossibility until you actually see it happen. And then when you get into the epicyclic equations and you finally figure out what it means, what it's telling you is that the reason why power is conserved in an ordinary transmission is because of where we choose to place the prime mover. If the prime mover is placed on the axis of symmetry, I don't care what arrangement you have. Any power gain that happens to be created in the system will be destroyed when the output is brought back to the center. And then I realized, oh my God, that's what Carini was trying to accomplish with his rotating flywheel with the motors on the outside. And so I started to look at the whole thing in earnest, and I eventually came up with, wait a minute, we'll have to come back to that. I eventually came up with this contraption, which is the gravitational torque amplifier, and it actually puts out twice as much torque as the motors are rated for by making use of a gravitational coupling with the Earth field. Now simultaneously, while we were doing all this work, what I realized was that if there's any validity to this stuff, it should be measurable. So we started to do actual work experiments in which these exotic orbiting motor contraptions were used to do physical work. Here you see a demonstration where a 4-pound weight is lifted through 4 feet, and it's got a timer connected to it and a micro switch that turns off the power when the work is done. And simply by changing from the orbital motor to the stationary motor, you can easily demonstrate a 2-to-1 ratio on the available horsepower. So that was very encouraging. And then I started to apply all of these things that I learned over the years into distinct embodiments. This device right here is a thing that we call a transforming generator, and this is on the DVD that I gave to various people to review. And what this does is it actually allows you to separate, for the first time in a device that's repeatable and measurable, the difference between an EMF and a voltage. And the problem is that anytime you have a winding, you wind up with 2 types of induction in that winding. You have LDIDT, which everybody is familiar with. That's the rate of change of current times the inductance. But you also wind up with IDLDT, which is essentially the miracle worker of these machines, and that's the current times the rate of change of inductance. And the reason why that's so interesting is if you do a dimensional analysis of the terms involved, it comes out to be negative resistance. And so that completes the four-quadrant vector diagram involving watts, vars, and negative watts. And now the whole picture starts to come together in a very succinct manner. And there's the little lab in Oklahoma City where we've been playing with this stuff. And there's me and Eric at the drawing board. And what we were trying to do at this point was to say, okay, if these things we've discovered are true and real, let's see if there's a way to apply it to solid-state circuitry in such a manner that we can secure similar results at the receiving end of the generation line rather than the source end. Because theoretically, with Thevenin's theorem, you can flip them back and forth. And so we came up with a very interesting circuit which we call SERPS, Switched Energy Resonant Power Supply. And this device makes use of the Steinmetz reflection criteria and allows us to send power back to the source under controlled conditions in such a way that it sets the actual power, not the current or the voltage, but the power into a form of oscillation. And the thing that's interesting about this is you can meter it with standard instruments, and the source will show you some number like, let's say, 100 watts, and the load will show you some number like 2,000 watts. And when you look at this, naturally the tilt sign comes on if you're a standard engineer, but the truth of the matter is you're not creating energy. What you're doing is making use of the difference between net work done and absolute work done. And we have a physicist here who can help you understand the difference. Mostly it has to do with displacement and definitions. However, in the real world, it represents a very practical and applicable form of science. Now this device here, I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on. This is a thing that we call a rotational translator, and it's a very important piece of work that I did in this whole detective story, because once I realized that all this stuff was possible, I kept asking myself the question, what the heck was Tesla using as his forcing function in the magnifying transmitter that could secure these results that we had seen in other applications? And so to kind of get a handle on it, I built this interesting device which is actually powered by a DC motor here in the center. It's got an AC two-pole alternator on the top and a series of switching circuits on the bottom. And this was tied into a network of impedances, and when this was rotated, the output signal from the AC generator was fed into a four-quadrant amplifier. The output of the amplifier was used to power the resistive and inductive networks, and then the waveform was looked at. And by tinkering with the settings on this, we were able to finally determine what the wave structure needed to look like in order to fulfill the Tesla magnification criteria. And then it went on to become a complete solid-state apparatus, which is one of the items that we're offering to Dr. Greer and his group. This is a very rare picture, but it actually comes into play in all of this. This is a picture of one of the original Tesla telluric oscillators. And the reason why this is so exciting is because Tesla fully understood the logarithmic decrement that's associated with any forcing function that's fed into a static medium, and the fact that the energy dissipates logarithmically. That naturally, his own forcing function was designed to get around that. And that was the reason why he was able to create the so-called earthquake in New York back in 1901 or 1902. And so naturally, it stands to reason that if I could do it electrically and he did it mechanically, it's a universal principle. And it's something that can be employed all over the place in any number of applications. And that's the final picture of the gravitational torque amplifier. So to summarize, where we stand with this now is very interesting. The work that I did on the gravitational torque amplifier demonstrated to me that what Tesla had actually discovered was the basic understanding of a mechanism that allows for work amplification to be accomplished. And the work is very different from the power, and it's very different from the energy. The normal standard belief is that I times V is always equal to I squared R. In a linear system, it's true. In a nonlinear system, they're completely different numbers. The same analogy can be applied to these mechanical devices. Since these slides were made, I have successfully built a very interesting and very well constructed device which allows me to demonstrate with very simple instruments and very simple duplicatable sources of power that you can in fact double the horsepower available from a given source simply by changing its reference frame with respect to the observer. And the reason that this is exciting is because I've been approached by the Japanese government to build windmills for them that work on this principle and use the mechanical device to power generators, eventually like the Dynaflux device, which I showed you earlier, and thereby produce a superior wind conversion mechanism. And the reason it excites me is because of the fact that this mechanism, unlike tapping the vacuum potential or some of the other more exotic things we've talked about that involve the ether or very complicated magnetic field structures, we're talking about a mechanical device. And it's going to be very interesting if this proves out and can be demonstrated to work, because when the information is released, you won't be talking to a handful of physicists worldwide that understand what you're saying. You'll be addressing tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of guys with a high aptitude for mechanics that would love to build a contraption like that and put it in their yard. And so that's exactly the kind of thing that I'd like to see, because one of the things that I can tell you, not only as a discoverer of certain principles, but also as a guy who's spent his whole life bent on applying these things for the benefit of the world, it doesn't do any good to understand the most fantastic information if you don't do something with it. And it doesn't do you any good to hand it to one other person, but if you can give something to everyone or to lots of people and actually elevate their level of consciousness, you know it's going to stick in the world. And so that's the reason why I've tried to have a twofold approach to this. My personal interests have always been towards the etheric, but my practical interests have always been towards things that the everyday guy can understand. And now, for the first time, with Dr. Greer's help, we may be in the position to actually bring some of this stuff out. Well, thank you very much for your time. If you have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. But I need water. Any number of things. Which device do you want to talk about?
Can we do away with utilities?
I think you're going to see a two-step, well, depending on what happens, you could see an immediate transition in devices that can be self-sustaining and independent from the grid. But on a larger scale, I can assure you that when you start talking about building machines of this sort in the multi-megawatt range, they're not going to appear overnight. Our current generators that are built by facilities like GE and Westinghouse have literally taken 100 years and billions of dollars to scale up, even though they're relatively linear. So I think you're going to also see the possibility of a transition phase in which you'll still remain attached to the grid for larger loads, but that you'll have the buffer of this type of equipment in between you and the load, which will allow a reprieve in the amount of money that it costs you to do whatever you're doing. So there's a whole bunch of possibilities. As far as the electronic circuit is concerned, when that's properly engineered and made commercially available, that would have a definite effect on personal homes and on small businesses and things of that nature. Could it slice your electric bill by a third or more? I mean, to a third or more. Right. So you be paying a whole lot less money for the same service. Now, the interesting thing about it is, this is not a ruthless attempt to screw the utilities. The way this was envisioned by Tesla was actually a twofold system. The energy that's reflected back, if it's done in large enough volume, okay, when it impinges upon the source, which in this case, let's say, is a huge steam-driven generator in some utility someplace, it literally converts that from a generator into a motor. And so for a portion of a cycle, that thing sees no load, just like the detour generators saw no load. The result of that, the average fuel consumption goes way down, the operational overhead comes down. The thing about it that's more interesting than that is that when you start using reflective kilowatts, which is what we're talking about here, it constitutes a new form of reactive power. And the reason why it's so exciting is because the same grid that's in place today, carrying kilowatts, if it were carrying reactive power, could service 1,000 times more customers without increasing the size of the generating facility. It's just the nature of the beast. It's actually dictated by the terms of the maximum power transfer theorem, which very clearly shows you that you max out on your transmission capabilities when the source impedance is equal to and conjugate to load impedance. So if you're doing that game resistively, you're immediately restricted by very severe limitations, but if you switch it to an impedance that's primarily reactive, and you reduce your resistance way down, which means your Q is going to go way up, then all of a sudden you're dealing with monstrous amount of power for the same input. This is the whole idea of Tesla's concept, but nobody's using it. And it's in every engineering book around. Just got to understand what it really means. Anybody else?
Well,
Okay.
let's try one. I mean, do you have any knowledge that any of the major utility companies or energy companies are exploring this in their R&D?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I can't tell you unequivocally that they are or they aren't. But years ago, I approached the R&D arm of the IEEE. And I asked them if there's any way I could get support to do some of this stuff. Incidentally, I've only had one grant in my whole life, and that was from the Franklin Institute. And the interesting thing about it was for a rebuild of the Dynaflux prototype. And we had as a monitor for this entire experiment the head electrical engineer of the Moore School as our prompter. And he did the setup of the experiment, he provided the instrumentation, and he did all the data collecting. And he turns to me in the middle of the operation and he says, hey, you know, he says, this machine puts out more power than it takes to run it. I said, I know that, that's why you're here. Well, he says, don't you understand that that's impossible? Therefore, it must be doing something else. So I said, okay, tell me what it's doing. He said, I'll get back to you on that. That was 20-some odd years ago.
It's got lost in the mail.
Yeah, but the answer to your question is interesting. When I approached the IEEE for support in their research end of the picture, they showed me their corporate charter. And interestingly enough, in the corporate charter, it dictates in black and white, bold print, no funding will be allowed for any over-unity device. Well, if they don't believe in it, what the hell is it in there for? You tell me. So I think that kind of answers the question, even though it's indirect.
You're kidding. That is in the charter.
Anything else, gentlemen?
Is it still in the charter? If I wanted to look it up?
I don't know. I haven't examined it lately, but you know, it was there, I assure you.
But you haven't had any recent efforts, I guess, to approach any of these companies, because you're outlining benefits to them. They may perceive it, or the lore is as a, you know, putting them out of business or something.
Well, I tell you what. When I did this first synchronous capacitor project for Bethlehem Steel, which was the company that hosted me on it, that was an 800,000 VAR synchronous capacitor, which is sizable. The whole time that I was their electrical superintendent, they used that thing. 2 weeks after I was transferred to Pennsylvania, the power company came over and told them to shut it down because they were not allowed to send power back in the opposite direction. Because this was in 1976 or something like that. Nowadays, I don't think it could be stopped. The interesting thing about it is this technology is 100 years old. It was standard in every great big manufacturing facility that had a time-varying electric load. Nowadays, nobody has ever heard of it. It's miraculous. You know, it's very strange. Anything else, gentlemen? And lady. Okay, well, thank you very much for your time.